There was one question my wife had been waiting almost 30 years to ask me, and when she finally asked it, I understood for the first time that I had been living beside a woman I thought I knew completely, and had somehow never truly seen. When Lynn asked if we could spend our retirement in Vietnam, I didn't laugh. I didn't get angry. I said something worse. I said, "Let's think about it." And then I changed the subject. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself I was protecting the life we'd spent 3 decades building together. Our son lived 20 minutes away. Our grandchildren were at the age where every weekend felt like something you couldn't get back. My cardiologist was here. My buddies from the army were here. Everything familiar was here. So when my wife looked at me one October evening on our back porch and asked that question so gently it barely made a sound, I gave her the answer I thought a responsible man was supposed to give. Looking back now, I don't think those 2 words were about caution at all. I think they were about fear, and I think somewhere deep down, I already knew I was answering the wrong question. That story starts a long time ago, 1996. I was 34 years old, working as a logistics coordinator for a small manufacturing company out of Cincinnati. A colleague of mine, a guy named Dale, had been living part-time in Ho Chi Minh City helping set up a supplier relationship, and he kept telling me I needed to come see it for myself. I had 2 weeks of vacation saved up and no real plan for them. I figured, why not? I had no idea that trip would become the story of my life. I met Lynn on my 4th day there. I wasn't looking for anyone. She wasn't looking for anyone either. She was 30 years old, working as an interpreter for a small business consulting firm downtown. The oldest of 4 children, responsible for helping her parents with everything from grocery runs to paperwork. The first thing she said to me was a correction. I'd mispronounced the name of the street we were standing on, and she told me exactly how it was supposed to sound, with a small smile that made it clear she was not being unkind. We ended up talking for 2 hours on a sidewalk outside a cafe. Then we walked to the river. Then we found dinner somewhere I couldn't have found again if I tried. By the time I flew back to Cincinnati, I had her phone number written on the back of a receipt, and I was already trying to figure out when I could come back. That was not the kind of man I had been before that trip. We talked on the phone for months. Long calls that cost more than I care to admit. Calls where we'd sit on opposite ends of the connection, just listening to each other breathe because neither of us wanted to hang up. 8 months later, I flew back, not for the company, not for Dale, but because I needed to see her again. We both knew by the end of that trip what this was becoming. 2 years after I met her on that sidewalk, Lynn arrived in Cincinnati with 2 checked bags, a carry-on with a few small gifts from her family, and a jade bracelet her mother had pressed into her hand at the airport. I remember watching her walk through arrivals and thinking how brave she was, how light she traveled. What I didn't think about, what I was too happy to think about, was everything she was leaving behind. The first winter hit her hard, not in a way she ever complained about, but I could see it. Back home, she'd worn light cotton dresses year-round. Here she stood in the hallway one December morning bundled in 2 sweaters and a coat I'd lent her, staring out the window at the gray. I asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. She said it the way people do when they've decided not to burden you. We got through that winter and the next one. Life filled up fast the way life does. We'd bought a house in a quiet neighborhood in Dayton. We had our son, Thomas, and then 3 years later, our daughter, Claire. We did the school pickups and the soccer practices and the holiday dinners and the birthday parties. I worked long hours. Lynn worked too, part-time at first, then full-time as her English got sharper and her network grew. She made friends. She learned how to navigate the DMV, the school board meetings, the HOA newsletters. She figured out Thanksgiving faster than I ever did, and she made it her own, every year adding a dish nobody else at the table had ever tried, and everybody always asked for the recipe. If you had met us at Thomas's high school graduation, you would never have guessed she hadn't grown up here. She laughed easily. She knew everybody's name. She remembered details about people's lives that most people don't bother to hold on to. She was the person at every gathering who somehow made each individual person feel like the most interesting one in the room. What I didn't see was the other part. Every Sunday morning, before the rest of the house was awake, she called her mother. I'd hear her voice from down the hall, sometimes laughing, sometimes low and quiet. There were mornings I walked past the bedroom, and she was sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to her cheek, just listening. When she'd see me, she'd smile immediately and wave me off. "Everything's fine," she'd say. I just wanted to hear her voice. I believed that. I don't know why I believed it so easily, but I did. Every January, after the Christmas decorations came down and the house settled back into its ordinary quiet, I'd find her at the kitchen table in the morning with her coffee going cold beside her. She wasn't reading. She wasn't on her phone. She was just sitting there in a particular kind of stillness that I recognized but couldn't name. I asked her once what she was thinking about. She smiled without looking up. "The light," she said. "I don't know what you mean," I told her. She looked at me then. "Back home it's already warm in January," she said. "The light is different." I nodded like I understood and poured myself more coffee and went about my morning. I thought she was just being wistful. I thought that was normal. Years passed the way they do when you're too busy to count them. Thomas grew up and got married and moved to a suburb 20 minutes north of us. Claire went to college in Columbus, came back, built a career, got a place downtown. Grandchildren started arriving. Thomas had 2, both under 5, and suddenly our weekends had a different shape, a better shape, full of noise and small sneakers left by the front door and crayon drawings on our refrigerator. Retirement stopped feeling theoretical. It was on the calendar. One evening in October, we were sitting on the back porch after dinner. The air had that first real bite of fall in it, the kind that comes earlier every year now. Lynn had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She was quiet for a minute, looking out at the yard, and then she turned to me. "When you retire," she said, "do you think you'd ever want to spend some time in Vietnam?" I want to be honest about how I answered her. I said, "Let's think about it." And then I said something about Thomas's kids, about how fast they were growing, about how I didn't want to miss those years. And then I got up to check the weather because I thought I'd heard there might be frost overnight. She didn't say anything else. She just nodded and looked back out at the yard. I told myself the conversation was over, but it stayed with me. Not in the way things stay with you when you're considering them, in the way things stay with you when you know you've handled them wrong and you're not ready to admit it yet. The weeks that followed, I started noticing things I'd been too busy to notice before. Or maybe I'd always noticed them and simply never stopped to ask what they meant. One Saturday afternoon, I was looking for a battery charger in the living room, and I found a notebook on the end table. Lynn's handwriting, Vietnamese which she still wrote in naturally, still thought in, I suspected, on the days when English felt like an effort. The notebook was open to what looked like a list. I didn't read it, but I stood there looking at that handwriting for a long moment, thinking about the fact that she had an entire interior life that moved in a language I didn't speak. That had always been true. I just hadn't thought about it in those terms before. A few days later, she was cooking dinner, the kind of meal she made when she was being quiet, a dish with a name I could never pronounce, something her mother used to make when the weather changed. The whole house smelled like lemongrass and something sweet I could never identify. I sat at the kitchen counter and watched her, and I thought, she has made this dish 100 times in this kitchen. She learned how to make it from a woman who lives on the other side of the world. She has made it here, in Ohio, in January every year, to keep something alive that had no other way of surviving in this climate. I didn't say any of that. I just said it smelled good. She said thank you and handed me a spoon to taste. A month before I officially retired, we drove down to Claire's apartment for her birthday dinner. Thomas and his wife were there, the grandkids were there. It was the whole family around a big table the way I like it best. Somewhere near the end of the meal, Thomas looked across the table and said, "So, you're really doing it." "What's the plan?" I laughed. I said, "Your mother and I are going to figure it out." Lynn smiled at me across the table. She reached over and put her hand on mine. "We're staying close to family," I said. "That's the plan. We've got 2 grandkids 20 minutes away. We're not going anywhere." I expected her to agree. She didn't disagree. She just took her hand back and reached for her water glass, and something about the way she did it made me stop talking mid-sentence. Nobody else noticed. The conversation moved on. But I noticed. That night, after we got home, I found her sitting in the living room with the lights low. Not watching anything, not reading. Just sitting. I came and sat beside her, and for a while neither of us said anything. "I didn't mean to speak for you tonight," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't say anything wrong," she said. "But?" She turned to look at me. She wasn't angry. That was the thing about Lynch. In 30 years, I could count on one hand the times she'd raised her voice. Her way of expressing something difficult was to become very still and very precise with her words. "When I left Vietnam," she said, "I made a choice. I knew what I was choosing. I was choosing you and the life we would build, and I never, not once, not for a single day, regretted it." She paused. "But I also left my mother, my sisters, my grandmother's grave. I left the place where every street and every smell and every face belongs to me." She looked down at her hands. I carried that with me. I still carry it. And I just wondered sometimes, if we had the chance to set some of it down together, whether you would want to do that with me. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. She patted my knee and said she was going to bed. And she walked down the hall, and I sat there in the low light of that living room for a long time. In 30 years of marriage, I had never asked her what she missed. I'd assumed she'd adapted. I'd assumed that because she was good at being here, she didn't ache for there. I had been so proud of how well she'd built a life in my country that I'd never once asked her what the building cost her. That question she asked me wasn't about Vietnam. It was about whether I'd ever been paying attention. About 2 weeks later, I was out in the garage looking for something to keep my hands busy. We'd been doing a lot of quiet coexisting since that evening on the couch. Not cold, not distant, just both of us sitting with something we hadn't finished saying. I was going through old boxes in the corner, the kind of boxes you move 4 times without opening, and I found one with her name on it in permanent marker. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Old ones, edges gone soft, colors shifted toward yellow. Her parents on what I recognized as their wedding day from a photo I'd seen framed in her mother's house. Her sisters as little girls. A house I'd seen in photos but never visited. Her grandmother's house, apparently, because there was an old woman sitting on the front step who looked enough like Lynn's mother that I knew immediately. There were pictures of her as a girl at school, in a white ao dai, squinting into the sun beside a group of girls I'd never met and never asked about. I sat down on an overturned crate and went through the whole box. She had brought all of this with her from Vietnam. She had moved it from our first apartment to this house, from one garage shelf to another, and kept every single one. I thought about what it takes to pack a box like that. What it means to carry photographs of people you might not see for years. What it means to be 30 years old and close a suitcase and know you are choosing one life over another, and that choosing one means leaving the other behind permanently. That night after dinner, I found her reading in the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed and I said, "I found a box in the garage with your name on it." She looked up. I said, "I went through it. I hope that's all right." She waited. "I saw your grandmother," I said. "I never knew what she looked like." She set her book down. "She died in 2009, Lynn said quietly. "I wasn't there. I hadn't known that either. We didn't talk for long that night. But something between us shifted. Something I hadn't known was closed began to open. A few weeks into my retirement, I walked into the living room one morning and sat down next to her and said, 'I've been thinking.' She put down her tea. 'I don't know if I'm ready to move to Vietnam. I have to be honest about that.' I think about Thomas's kids. I think about what happens if one of us needs a doctor. I think about being that far from Claire when she might need us. Those things are real." She nodded. "But I've been asking the wrong question," I said. "I've been asking whether I want to move. I should have been asking what you've been carrying for 30 years, and whether I want to help you set it down." She looked at me for a moment without speaking. "What if we just went?" I said. "Not to move, not to decide anything, just to go together, the two of us, for a few months. No agenda, just, I want to see what you see when you're there." She didn't make a big thing of it. She just reached over and held my hand and said, "Okay." 3 months later, we landed in Da Nang. I'd been to Vietnam exactly twice before, both times for work, both times in Ho Chi Minh City, both times moving too fast to see anything clearly. This was different. The first thing I noticed when we landed wasn't the humidity, though believe me, I noticed the humidity. It was Lynn. She walked through the airport differently than she walked anywhere at home. Not faster, not louder, not more expressive, just differently grounded. Like a person who has been balancing on a surface that tips slightly in every direction for a very long time and has just stepped onto something level. She didn't need to translate anything. She didn't need to explain herself. She just moved through the world, and it moved around her the way it was supposed to. I understood within about 48 hours that I had not been learning about Vietnam on this trip. I had been learning about my wife. We spent a month there. Her 2 younger sisters came for a week. I watched Lynch around them in a way I'd never been able to watch her in Ohio. She was lighter, faster, louder. She interrupted people and got interrupted back, and nobody took offense. She laughed in a way I'd heard before, but not often enough. One afternoon, all 4 of us went to the market. Just the regular market, nothing scenic. The kind of place where people buy vegetables and argue about the price. And Lynch navigated it with a fluency that had no equivalent anywhere in our Dayton life. She knew which stall to buy from and why. She knew which vendor to joke with and what to say. She knew the smell of a good mango versus a mediocre one. She existed there in a way that was entirely and completely herself. I watched her, and I thought, I have been married to this woman for 30 years, and I am only now seeing half of her. One evening her oldest sister took us to the neighborhood where Lynch grew up. The house they'd lived in was gone, replaced by something newer, but a few of the surrounding houses were the same. An old neighbor came out when she heard Lynn's voice. A woman in her late 70s who grabbed Lynn by both hands and said something I didn't catch, and Lynch laughed and said something back, and for about 5 minutes they just stood there in the street talking, and then the woman patted Lynn's face and went back inside. Walking back, I asked what they'd been saying. She said, "I look old," Lynn said. I laughed. "What did you say?" I said, "She looks exactly the same." She smiled. "She doesn't, but that's what you say." That night we sat on the balcony of the place we were renting, watching the street below. It was warm, obviously, warmer than I would prefer for the rest of my natural life. But I sat there and I didn't complain about it. Somewhere below us, someone was playing music I didn't recognize. Motorbikes moved through the light. Lynn sat beside me with her eyes half closed, and I watched her breathe, and I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. She had never been homesick in the dramatic sense. She had never wept at the airport, or demanded we go back, or made me feel guilty for the life we chose. She had simply, quietly, every day for 30 years, carried a version of herself that belonged somewhere else, and she had done it without complaint, and she had done it because she loved me, and because she had made a choice, and she honored her choices. And all I had to do was ask. On our last night there, before the flight back, we went to dinner at a place her sister recommended, a small family restaurant with 4 tables, and a menu that changed based on what came in that morning. I ordered something I couldn't identify, and it was the best thing I'd eaten in years. Afterward, we walked along the water for a while, and I said, "I want to come back." She looked at me. "Not for a few months," I said. "I want to figure out what it would actually take. Whether we could split our time, whether we could make it work. She didn't answer right away. She just kept walking, looking at the water. Then she said, "I've been making things work for a long time." "I know," I said. "I'd like it to be my turn." She stopped walking. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen only a few times in our marriage. Not happy exactly. Not relieved exactly. Something quieter than either. Something that looked like being truly and completely understood by another person, which is rarer than it should be, and more valuable than almost anything. "Okay," she said. She took my arm and we kept walking. 18 months later we split our time. 6 months in Dayton for Thomas's kids, for Claire, for the doctors, for the people I love who are rooted there. 6 months in Da Nang, for Lynn's sisters, for the light in January, for the food, for the version of my wife that I was 30 years late to meet. People ask me sometimes if it was hard to adjust. Honestly, the adjusting has been mine to do, mostly. Lynn adjusted 30 years ago, and she did it quietly and completely, and she never once asked me to notice. All she ever asked was whether I'd be willing to try. People also ask what made me change my mind. I tell them the truth, it wasn't one thing. It was a box of photographs in a garage. It was a woman standing in a market, knowing which mango to buy. It was 30 years of Sunday morning phone calls I'd heard and never really listened to. The best decision I ever made was marrying Lynch. Every decision that's come after has just been me trying to catch up to the size of what she gave me when she said yes. I thought, for a long time, that she was the one who had left home to be with me. I was wrong. We both left something. She just carried hers without making me feel the weight.